Good evening. I'm Mark Miller, Dean here at the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, those here in Tucson for what passes for a rare winter day, and the many of you attending from faraway places as well. Today, when thoughtful, inclusive dialogue is so important to strengthening our civic institutions, we are delighted to create a forum for learning and intellectual engagement. Established through the generosity of our 1955 alumnus, Donald Pitt, the Pitt Family Foundation Speaker Series will bring some of the nation's most prominent and influential voices in law, democracy, and public policy to our virtual campus. Tonight's inaugural event for the Pitt Family Foundation Speaker Series is with a prominent and brilliant scholar and public intellectual, Dr. Eddie Glaude. We thank Mr. Pitt and his family for their interest and support in promoting these critical conversations. And we invite all of you to join us for the entire series throughout this term. You can find our schedule at law.arizona.edu. The speaker series is an important component in our participatory democracy initiative, which is led by former Tucson Mayor Jonathan Rothschild and established in part by the generosity of Arizona Law alumni Mary Greer and Nancy Kelly and the Hari Trust. With partners in the School of Government and Public Policy and in the School of Journalism, and under Jonathan's able leadership, we hope to develop a rich array of training, educational, and research opportunities for students. The Participatory Democracy Initiative also seeks opportunities to engage members of the broader community, as the challenge the initiative addresses are a key part of what we face in our times. Today's event fills that hope. With that, I cede the virtual podium to Jonathan Rothschild to introduce our speaker, Dr. Eddie Glaude.
All right, we're still filling the room as we speak, so I'm going to speak a little more slowly as a result of that. But first of all, I want to thank everyone who is joining on this call. We have a great attendance of folks that signed up, and people are now entering the room. Obviously, I want to thank Dr. Glaude. While we're waiting for people to come in, I do want to explain how this is going to proceed. Dr. Glaude is going to speak for as long as he would like, and then we are going to take questions from the audience, and you can enter those questions, I believe, through the Q&A or through the chat room, and those questions will then be given to me, and I will give them to Dr. Glaude. Because of the amount of folks that we have coming in this evening, we may not be able to get to all the questions, but Dr. Glaude has been gracious enough to say that if we record the questions, which we will, and send them to him, he will try to get back answers that we can then get to you. So we will do our best to get those answers to you. You do have to go through the Q&A, not the chat room. So if you have questions, go through the Q&A. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Eddie Glaude Jr. Dr. Glaude is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University. Dr. Glaude received his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, and then went on to get his master's at Temple and his PhD from Princeton University. Before Princeton, he taught at Bowdoin, and he's been a visiting scholar at both Harvard and Amherst. Dr. Glaude's first book, Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation, in early 19th century Black America won the Modern Languages Association Book Award for that year in its category. He is the author of 7 books, including In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, and Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. His most recent book is Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. I'm putting it up there so everybody can see it. It was released in June of this year, so it's very timely, and it's a great read, talking about the complexity of how we come together as a nation and realizing that we've been here before, and what did we learn and what could we learn. Dr. Glaude is a regular speaker on Msnbc, on The Morning Joe. I note that he's even taken these lessons to heart, and I think appeared on Mr. Hannity's show from time to time. I would normally say it is before Zoom to give a warm Tucson welcome to, but given the way we are in our pandemic, on this unusual snowy day in Tucson, let's go with, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce as our first inaugural speaker at the Pitt Family Foundation Speaker Series for Participatory Democracy, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. Dr. Glaude, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brother Jonathan. I really appreciate that gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Dean Miller, thank you. I want to thank Bernadette and all the folks behind the scenes who are making this possible. Especially want to thank the Pitt family for your generosity. I think this speaker series is so important. We need to think together about the challenges we face as a deliberative democracy. And I'm delighted to begin to inaugurate this series. So we have a little time, but I want to make sure we have some time for questions. I want to jump right into this. So let me begin with a couple of epigraphs. One is from James Baldwin's 1972 text, No Name in the Street. It was written in 1972, and it's titled, the quotation goes, "It is terrible to watch people cling to their captivity and insist on their own destruction. I think Black people have always felt this about America and Americans, and have always seen spinning above the thoughtless American head the shape of the wrath to come." The second quotation comes from one of my favorite essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Circles, published in 1840. "Our culture is the predominance of an idea which draws after it this train of cities and institutions. Let us rise into a new idea and they will disappear," end quote. So first, again, I want to thank all the people who've made my time with you possible. I'm delighted to be here. And my task is to, in some ways, offer a few preliminary remarks about where we've been and what we've done and who we might aspire to be. And I do so with the full understanding of what has happened recently in our country. Just a little over 2 weeks ago now, a mob of mostly white men and women sacked the US Capitol. They roamed the halls of the People's House and declared that they were there to stop the steal, to act as patriots on behalf of a country in peril, as they believed. And many Americans watched as the Capitol Police, I know I did, as the Capitol Police were overrun. And as some among them seemingly agreed with what was, by any measure, an insurrection. I couldn't help but think at the time of the police response to the protests after the murder of George Floyd. Of course, there was violence then. Minneapolis exploded. But I recall the peaceful marches and how they confronted a militarized police force, rubber bullets and tear gas, images of police aggressively accosting protesters. On January 6th, as some officers risked and gave their lives in defense of the Capitol, I saw others taking selfies, and even one policeman helping a woman in a camel-haired coat, wearing a red, white, and blue palm beanie with Trump emblazoned on the front of her hat, walk down the steps of the Capitol. She was a part of the group that stormed the building and now was among those who simply walked out. It was an astonishing representation of a different register of civic expression, of who has the right to dissent and who can claim ownership of the country without fear of punishment by the state. It's a kind of different expression or an example of the different registers of citizenship, that some can claim possession of the country while others should simply shut up and be grateful. Now, in many ways, the insurrection was the logical extension of the conservative counter to the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century. For well over 40 years now, we have been living in that reaction. As some railed against big government and so-called entitlement programs, and others built the carceral state that has resulted in the incarceration of millions of Americans, mostly Black and brown and poor. We have witnessed over these 40 years the evisceration of any robust conception of the public good, as the idea of citizenship has given way to the notion that we are all self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends, in competition and rivalry with others. Some scholars, like the political theorist Wendy Brown, describe this as the political rationality of neoliberalism. However you describe it, this has been one of the enduring legacies of Reaganism. Right? Alongside the flattening of wages for working people, the skyrocketing of student loan debt, the general precarity of working people, as the rich has continued to extract resources for themselves and the rest have struggled to keep their noses above water. And I'm not really saying anything that's radical here. One can recall the words of Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Fed, who said that one of the greatest threats to American democracy was this increasing divide, this increasing wealth inequality. Even President Obama, after the end of his 8 years in office, noted the dangerous implication of the gap between those who have and those who do not. In so many ways, the reaction, the conservative counter, the backlash, the betrayal, however we want to describe it, to the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, to the cultural revolution of the mid-20th century, the reaction to the demand for a more racially just America, right, involved in some ways the dismantling of the Great Society, a wholesale attack on the very framework of the New Deal. In so many ways, I think, and I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, our politics today have been overdetermined by the terrors and panic of the so-called forgotten American, or the silent majority. A panic rooted in part in the unsettling sense that the whiteness of the country was and is under siege. What we saw on the steps of the Capitol were those Americans in full revolt, right, in the face of the prospect that their world is in fact dying. James Baldwin's words continue to remain relevant here. The horror is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all, end quote. Now, over the last 4 years, we have experienced a kind of a hyper-polarized political environment that reflects the deep divisions within the country. White, Black, rural, urban, rich, poor, Republican, Democrat. These divisions are all in view, in full view. And it feels as if the institutions and norms of our democracy are collapsing right in front of our bloodshot eyes. No matter where you stand on the political spectrum, it seems that someone needs to be held to account for the insurrection on January 6th. But if the vote in the Senate suggests anything today, that might not be the case. But these institutions and norms of our democracy that feel like they're collapsing, think about it. Over the last 4 years, we've seen the imperial presidency out of control. And some of us have warned about the dangers of expanding executive power to American democracy, whether a Republican was in office or a Democrat. We've seen, in some ways, the People's House, the Congress, stymied by hyperpartisanship, in part a result of gerrymandering, which in some ways undermines genuine representation in the Congress. And look at the Senate, the nation's, or some people would say the world's most important deliberative body. I mean, that institution seems to be broken. We've even witnessed the politicization of the military and the courts. Just think about it. 15, 16 members of the National Guard were sent home because they could not pass, right, a certain kind of vetting, as many worried that white supremacists had infiltrated, right, not only the military, but law enforcement throughout the country. Now you combine, right, this collapsing of our institutions and the norms of democracy, or what appears to be a collapse, with the fact that COVID-19 rages and ravages in the country, over 400,000 dead. And some project that perhaps 500,000 will be dead by the end of February. You know, Americans in this moment are dying alone. And those who love them must grieve with the regret of not being able to say goodbye properly. And, you know, and in so many ways, those who are on the margins, essential workers, Black and brown people, we are dying disproportionately. In so many ways, the virus has metastasized within the extant fissures of American society, revealing deep inequalities and disparities in our healthcare system, right? Revealing housing insecurity, food insecurity, and the like. And of course, what joins with the devastation of COVID, or in some ways a consequence of it, is the fact that our economy is in tatters. Millions are unemployed and hunger grips the nation. But the top 1% thrives. They are getting richer as death travels from door to door, a kind of COVID-19 capitalism, as it were. All of this that I've just described joins with the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The district attorney didn't even find it necessary to charge the police officer who shot him in the back 7 times with 3 kids in the car with reckless endangerment. Or the police killing of Trayford Pillerin in Lafayette, Louisiana, or the public murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, or the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, the death of Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, of Ahmaud Arbery. I could go on. In so many ways, we face a kind of moral reckoning in this country, a fundamental challenge to what we mean by we the people. And it begs the question, at least for me, it begs the question, how do we imagine unity in the face of all of this? How do we revitalize deliberative democracy in the face of the devastating impacts of the storms that we're currently living through? One wonders how we will answer these questions, right? We know that for some, calls for unity are merely appeals to maintain the status quo, to leave unaccountable those who have threatened to topple our democracy. And to be sure, there was a sense in which our country stood on a knife's edge. We still have a fragmented media landscape where lies are often presented as truths in the name of profit and entertainment. Americans reside in ideological silos, that complicate, if not undermine, the very idea of deliberation among a generally informed public. I remember when people worried about the tabloids like the National Enquirer, right? We complained that Crossfire, right, in some ways compromised journalism. We worried about the effects of opinion on the reporting of fact. Today, those concerns feel like the graphics of a first-generation Atari game console. What some are calling the big lie about the presidential election, that Democrats stole the election from Donald Trump. For me, that lie is predicated on an even bigger lie that constitutes the through line of American history. That lie involves or entails this claim that only white Americans matter, and by extension, that only white voters matter. And some among us are willing to name the lies about the election, but they seem a bit reluctant to name this bigger lie that lurks beneath it all. Now, what stands out to me, and I think the last 4 years and few weeks have made this abundantly clear, is that the American idea is in trouble. And that idea that it's an idea that in some ways presupposes a kind of consensus predicated on a unifying notion of whiteness that is in crisis, I believe, in this moment. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today we confront the ugliness of who we are, I believe. And that ugliness isn't just about who occupies the White House or murderous police officers or loud racists screaming horrible things. It involves the millions of Americans who, even with the evidence of the last 4 years, still voted for Donald Trump. Some of whom sacked the Capitol because they believed the election was stolen. Because some believe that only white voters matter. For many, with their white militia paraphernalia, this was a riot fueled by white resentment, white grievance, and white hatred. And what has been revealed is that the ideology of white supremacy threatens once again to swallow whole this fragile experiment in democracy. It also reveals, I think, the bankruptcy of a political and economic ideology that for the last 40 years has had the nation by the throat. This ideology, among other things, has imagined liberty as a superordinate value apart from any concern about justice, and liberty, in some ways, has become a synonym for selfishness. All of which has had a devastating effect on the polity, it seems to me. It is clear, and the violence of January 6th is the evidence, that the November election didn't settle any of this. To be sure, I'm happy, I admit my ideological commitments here. I'm happy to see the back of Donald Trump's head, as my mother would say. But I pray that we do not trade one fantasy for another. That somehow Trump's defeat will affirm America's inherent goodness and put a grateful republic back to sleep. Presidential elections alone, no matter how momentous, do not settle the question of who we take ourselves to be. And the answer to that question will emerge in what we do now. The Biden-Harris administration will have to grapple with at least 3 interlocking crises that are intensifying by the day. Of course, the death unleashed by COVID-19 and what that death, the dead will say to us about who we take ourselves to be as a nation. But that death has to also be we have to deal with it also in relation to the epidemic of selfishness that threatens to choke the life out of the polity. And here I'm thinking about Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness, right? Where selfishness has become a virtue, where this political ideology has made us self-interested persons with little or no obligation to our fellows. Right? And then, of course, that selfishness joins with the fact of loneliness. We were already concerned about Americans bowling alone, locked into our narrow spaces without a robust sense of mutuality and connectedness. What would it mean then for death and selfishness and loneliness to combine? Right? Together they fertilize what very well may be the killing fields of American democracy. So much is in front of us. Part of what I think needs to happen is a new social and moral contract, one that announces our obligations to each other. It states our values as a democratic society over again. That contract, I believe, should consist in at least three parts that involve, right, healthcare, that involves a guarantee of a quality of life, that involves safety and security, right? And we have to tell ourselves a different story about who we are and who we aspire to be. I mean, just think about the contrast, for example, between the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission Report. But that's another story. We cannot, it seems to me, continue to tell ourselves a story of American virtue that secures our innocence if we are to make it through this moment of crisis. In fact, James Baldwin insisted that the country confront the lie that sustains its innocence. As he put it in The Fire Next Time, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime, end quote. And this lie, no matter the crisis that may bring us to the brink of change, reasserts itself and we all the time, and we end up simply tinkering around the edges, leaving the fundamental contradiction in place, changing, but not really changing. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lies that America told itself. In an essay published in 1964 entitled Nothing Personal, Baldwin put the point succinctly. We are, quote, afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies, Baldwin says. And not only, for example, about race, whatever by this time in this country or indeed in this word may mean, but about our very natures, he says. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts. I mean, as a child of the South, I mean, this is a perfect description of that region. I know it's hard to admit it, but the United States has never been a beacon of virtue, especially from the vantage point of the tradition out of which I come. That is, those blues people who didn't come here by way of Ellis Island. It is not an example of democracy achieved. In some ways, the political theorist Judith Sklar in her presidential address at the APSA said, America really didn't become a genuine democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Prior to that moment, it was a hair-invoked democracy. Perhaps she was a bit too optimistic there. Nor have we been, even though Ronald Reagan added the adjective to John Winthrop's description, nor is the country the shining city on the hill. We tell ourselves this lie in order to protect ourselves from what we've done and from the complexity of who we actually are. If you get a chance, read William Hoagland's wonderful piece about consensus history in The New Republic, which was just published yesterday, which gives us a sense of how this consensus narrative emerged and the role that the historian Edmund Morgan played in its production. Baldwin understood that our problems in the United States went beyond who occupied the White House or the latest example of American racism. For him, we had to get to the rot at the heart of the matter. And this would require, and I believe he's right, that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred. Tell the truth about ourselves so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. As Baldwin wrote in Nothing Personal, quote, to be locked in the past means, in effect, that one has no past, since one can never assess it or use it. And if one can not use the past, one cannot function in the present, and so one can never be free. I take this to be the American situation, Baldwin writes, in relief, the root of our unadmitted sorrow, end quote. Americans are trapped in a history they refuse to know, but carry within themselves. The terrors and panic they experience, what we saw on January 6th, have everything to do with the gap between who Americans imagine themselves to be and who deep down we really are. That the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. And for James Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. Imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land, stuck being lost boys and lost girls. Now, I cannot help but connect all of this insight to what I've witnessed over the last 4 years and over the last few weeks. Americans who refused to grow up reveled in the fantasy that Trump represented, that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. All along, at least to me, Trumpism felt as if it was a kind of suppressed terror and panic, felt as if suppressed terror and panic lurked beneath the surface of their rants and hatreds, that the seams would unravel and reveal the true monstrosity hidden underneath a cheaply made MAGA hat and t-shirt. Now, how do we keep fighting when the times seem so dark? How do we muster the energy and courage to keep pushing what seems to be, right, the Sisyphean boulder up the hill when, as Baldwin said, America changes all the time without changing at all? Baldwin had to ask himself those questions. He had to come to terms with what happened to the Black freedom struggle in such a short period of time. He had to understand the angry cries of Black power, the white fantasy that was Ronald Reagan. He had to tell the truth even as cancer ravaged his body. And here we are today, even with his witness in hand and the forces unleashed by the latest version of the American fantasy, threatening as they've always done to destroy the very foundations of the country. The answer to the question, how do we keep fighting, is not easy to come by. Now, in 1962, James Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. There he wrote, quote, "The effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more, and then a little more. We must, as Jimmy put it, deal with what words hide and what they reveal. This is all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories obscure the horrors of what we've done and ensure our innocence and inherent goodness. Telling the truth in America, especially in dark times like these, requires a certain kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety and comfort and protection for the order of things. It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release us into a new way of being together. This will entail at times a withering criticism of the past that haunts and constrains, a scathing critique of our self-conception. And we can tell this truth without situating ourselves along the ideological spectrum as it's currently configured. We tell the truth because of a deep and abiding concern for the fate of the country. Baldwin insisted that we ask the hard question: how shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? He understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involved what we tell ourselves, for example, about Black and brown people and white people, that white people ought to be valued more in this country than others. We witness the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view in terms of our dispositions and practices. As Baldwin put it, and I think we must follow his words today, if we are to survive our own darkness, that we must describe us to ourselves as we now are. He aimed for a kind of, a kind of perception, right, at the pitch of passion, to echo the language of Henry James. And this formulation, to my mind, allows us to see the work of the poet in describing things as they are. And here Baldwin is echoing Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1848, and what he wrote about the poet, quote, "One who shall draw us with love and terror, who sees through our comforting illusions, chants our own times and social circumstances, and speaks of the unique genius that is America. Baldwin just simply brings Emerson across the railroad tracks, as it were. He takes him to the other side of town. In the end, I'm coming to a close. So, that's a preacherly ploy. I got a little bit more to go. In the end, America has to choose whether it will finally become a multiracial democracy, a genuinely multiracial democracy. And this involves grappling with the past that continues to haunt our present living. Understanding that George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Jacob Blake or Walter Wallace or Casey Goodson or Adrian Hill, that these were simply the latest victims of the slave codes that have shaped the way Black communities are policed in this country. And the point here is not to suggest that Black people are still slaves and that police are slave catchers. Rather, Baldwin captures with the image the logic behind why Black people are treated so and why brown people are treated so. The slave code brings into view a host of assumptions about who is valued and who is not, about who has standing in this country and who can be treated with a generalized sense of disregard. We have to confront, as Baldwin put it in Notes on the House of Bondage, that, quote, the real impulse of the bulk of the American people toward their former slaves is lethal. If he cannot be used, Baldwin writes, he should be made to disappear, end quote. When the forgotten American rebels, when the so-called silent majority screams and shouts, they are really cursing, the other in their midst. And the other better know it. To confront this fact, to honestly admit this, is to recognize, I think, that the trouble, as Baldwin wrote, is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. And we will never establish the kind of democracy we aspire to until we stare our ghastly failures in the face. This is a challenge Americans must take up. The country stands on a knife's edge, that the background conditions that make our democracy possible have cracked. We have to dare to be otherwise, to do everything in our power to break from the old frames that have us trapped in categories that blind us to the humanity of those around us. I'm reminded of one of the formulations of Baldwin's earliest essays, Everybody's Protest novel, published in 1949, where he said, quote, our passion for categorization, life neatly fitted into pegs, has led to an unforeseen paradoxical distress, confusion, a breakdown of meaning. These categories, which were meant to define and control the world, for us have boomeranged us into chaos, in which limbo we whirl, clutching the straws of our definitions, end quote. Weber's iron cage by a different name, I suspect. Americans must understand that racial justice, if it is to be genuine, is not a philanthropic enterprise. It isn't an act of charity. It is not yours to give to anyone. We have to break that frame. We have to live into a different way of being together. And that means, in my view, committing ourselves to building a country that affirms the dignity and sacrality of every human being, no matter the color of their skin, their zip code, or where they're from, who they love, their gender or ability. It must involve a revolution of value, a shift in who and what we value. In order for this to happen, Americans will have to tell themselves the truth about our failures, and we will have to take the risk to do something bold and visionary. We have to step outside of our comfort zones, stop fighting on the old battlefields, shift the ground beneath our feet, and we can do this as we join together to face the cascading crises that threaten to shatter the very foundations of this polity. As Baldwin said a year before his death, quote, we are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not white, this world. It is not black either. The future of this world depends on everyone in this room, and that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which now cannot bear the weight of reality. Baldwin once said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. America changes all the time, but America always stays the same. Why? Because we refuse to face who we are. Such powerful words for our country in this time of storm and stress. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges. We cannot aspire for unity and leave the old frame intact. I think the cost would be too high. We must shake from the shibboleths of the past and their gods and begin again. Remembering that no matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility. We must risk everything now to finally put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. That will be hard work. But as Baldwin says, human beings are at once disasters and miracles. If we show up and risk ourselves in this moment, if we show up, we at least have a chance for a miracle. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Glaude. You've given us a whole lot to think about, and we've got already a whole lot of questions in the queue. I'm going to try to go through them as best I can. A lot of them are friendly, and a few of them are pretty challenging, as you might expect.
Great.
Exactly. So the first one is actually from our Dean of Students. I'm not going to mention a lot of people's names, but when it's somebody who's prominent at the university, Kendall Washington White is the Dean of Students. She says, I love your shelves of books read by each of them and prominently viewed on Msnbc's Morning Joe. My question is, what led you to join Msnbc, and how do you think your voice impacts the viewers?
Thank you so much for your question. When I published my book, Democracy in Black, in 2016, I was not such a popular voice because I was very critical of Barack Obama. I actually described President Obama as a Melvillian confidence man in that book. And I was invited on Morning Joe's to talk about the thesis of the book. And Joe and Mika apparently took a liking to me, I suppose, and I kept getting invited back onto the show. So what's fascinating is my entree into MSNBC wasn't through the kind of liberal shows, Rachel Maddow or then Melissa Harris Perry's show or Chris Hayes. I actually came into the MSNBC family through the conservative shows, engaging in dialogue with Joe Scarborough and others. And Nicole Wallace at the time did not have her show. She was actually a regular on Morning Joe. And it's in that space that, I found myself having arguments and exchanges with people on the other side of the aisle or who had different views than I did. So I think, part of what I've been trying to do is to figure out how to introduce nuance and complexity within the context of a soundbite. How to bring the weight of my bibliography, my training as a scholar in African American studies and as a philosopher of religion to bear on the problems of the day. At the end of the day, Jonathan, I'm a scholar of John Dewey. And so given that American pragmatist bent, philosophy at its best is a form of social criticism. So I think I've been able to avoid certain trappings of the contemporary media landscape by just simply cultivating the habits of listening and saying what's on my mind and in my heart without worry about being on television, if that makes sense.
It does. Listening and saying what's in your heart in a way that will let other people listen probably will help us go a long way. The next question is from a professor at the College of Law. Dr. Glaude, could you comment on the Senate filibuster and per this question, its racist roots. You could talk about that. Should it be eliminated? And what would you say in order to persuade, let's say, Kyrsten Sinema, who's our senator, who's indicated she is not interested in giving up that tradition, to eliminate it, or should it be eliminated?
Well, I think, look, when we think about the way in which the filibuster has been used over its history, right? It has been principally deployed to block, legislation aimed at ending the second-class status of Black folk. It has, in some ways, been a principal tool of a minority voice to, in some ways, hold the country by the throat. It also has been used by others to prevent the other side from, whether it's around denying women, right to choose and the like. So it has been used by both sides, but it's principally a tool that has been used by those who want to defend an idea of America as a white nation. At least that's my view. Now, I think this is what we have to confront. The Senate is broken. The deliberative body doesn't work. And the question is, given the scale of the problems we face as a nation, what do we need to do in order to pass legislation that can actually respond to the problems we face as a country? And that's what we have to confront. I think part of the moment involves a kind of post-partisan moment. And I know that sounds terribly naive, but it has everything to do with the fact that we have a civil war going on in both parties. We really actually have 4 different kinds of political currents moving at the same time in the country, right? Some people want to equate the far right with the far left. I don't believe in that kind of equation. I think you have this civil war within the Republican Party that could be represented as Trumpists, never Trumpers, libertarians, and the like, however we want to describe them. And then you have the kind of progressive and corporate wing or centrist wing of the Democratic Party having their conflicts. And all of that is happening at the very moment in which the nation is in crisis, right? Where American capitalism is teetering on a knife's edge, right? That where COVID-19 has revealed the deep fissures in the country. So part of what I think, this is how I'm approaching the question around the filibuster, is that if it is actually getting in the way of the kind of legislation that is required to respond to the scale of crisis we face, then we need to get rid of it, because the polity is at stake, right? The republic is at stake in this regard. That's my view today. I might have an even more nuanced view by tomorrow.
So the questions are really flying in now. We'll get to as many as we can in the time.
I'll be shorter with my answer.
So let me see here. Let me try this one. This is a good question. People of color supported Reagan. They supported Trump. Probably, from what I've read, maybe more this time supported Trump than in the past. Can you explain that phenomena? And
sure,
yeah,
sure. White people don't have they don't own selfishness and greed. It's not their possession. So you have African Americans and Latinos who are Latinx communities and folks within API communities who like the tax cut, who are committed to a certain set of economic positions that is consonant with their own view of what constitutes the good. So, it's, greed isn't the possession of white Americans, right? You can have other people who hold those views. And so part of what we have to do is kind of, not paint or not generalize from a certain percentage to the folks broadly. I mean, for example, one wouldn't want to conclude that because there were examples of Black people holding slaves, that somehow the institution of American slavery was not racist in its core, at its core, even though you had Black folk owning slaves, right? No, you had Black folk who were greedy, participating in an economic system that allowed them to exploit Black bodies for their own labor, for their own profits and the like, exploiting an opening that allowed them to do so. So my answer to that question is pretty straightforward, right? We cannot assume that because you have a Black community or brown community, that all the people within that community will hold the same political positions. In some ways, that makes that community pre-political, right? As if there's no politics that needs to happen there, right? Because there are disagreements, and we need to understand those disagreements for what they are. But that should not lead us to conclude, right, that somehow the fact of Reaganism or the fact of Trumpism did not disproportionately impact Black and brown communities negatively, right, in terms of the policies themselves. Yeah, that's how I answer that.
All right. Well, here's a good question when I've thought about a little myself. What can we learn, or can we learn from the reconciliation process in South Africa? Is that something that we can utilize as a model, or is it something that doesn't come across the ocean?
I think, I've been thinking about this a lot. In fact, in Begin Again, I talk about this. You have HR 40, which is in some ways the piece of legislation that is trying in some ways to get us to talk about reparations. And reparations is not just simply writing a check to every Black person in the country, but thinking about racial inequality as the result of policy decisions, right? Not just simply the result of individual acts of prejudices, right? But there's a reason why we have the wealth gap. There's a reason why it has everything to do with FHA loans and who was cut, has everything to do with who were locked out of the New Deal, how the vaunted American middle class was built and how Black people were locked out of it, right? Just as an example, as if we didn't have a dual housing market, as if we didn't have a dual labor market. The fact that my dad couldn't go to Princeton, right? Even though I'm an endowed university professor at Princeton, right? What I had to go through in order to get to this place, in this position in my life, right? So HR 40 is a kind of, a study about reparations. And then Congresswoman Barbara Lee has put forward legislation about for kind of racial healing, truth and reconciliation commission, which involves, I think, confronting our past honestly, which is what Baldwin asked us to do. And remember what Brian Stevenson says, right? That truth and reconciliation are sequential. First, you got to tell the truth. And that sets the stage for reconciliation, which then sets the stage for repair. And so when you go down to Montgomery and you go to, the quote unquote lynching memorial, you go to that museum, there's a confrontation that isn't resolved by American perfectionism, or isn't resolved, right, in some, we're always on our way to being a more perfect union, right? It wants us to confront the ugliness squarely. So the short answer to the question is yes, I think it can translate. It's just a matter of the will. The fantasy is really important to us. The myth it's critical. And I think many Americans believe that we might not be able to survive without it. And they're willing to die for it in some ways and kill for it.
So let me ask you a thoughtful question, then we'll get a little more to a challenge of you. But the thoughtful question, do you find hope in the words of James Baldwin? And if so, what is that hope, and how do we act out on it?
Such a great question. I found this formulation in an interview with Jimmy in Istanbul, 1970. King was murdered in 68. Baldwin has a nervous breakdown in 60. He tries to commit suicide in 69. He's in Istanbul, really trying to pick up the pieces. And the reporter asks him about hope. And it's this wonderful line. He says, his response is, hope is invented every day. Hope is invented every day. And it's a kind of blues-soaked hope. And the image that comes to mind is this. What motivates you to get out of bed knowing that the world is organized in the way it is? That it's arrayed against your dreams and possibilities, that it conspires to make you small. How do you swing your feet around and plant them on the floor and get up? Baldwin says in that moment, hope must be invented, and it's invented every day. So I combine that insight with the fact that, the disasters that we can be miracles. And if we show up, as I ended, if human beings show up, my God, look at what we can do, right? Look at what we can do. So my hope is in us, but I have to invent that every day, given what we often do, if that makes sense.
Okay. So you touched a nerve with a number of folks in the audience when you said that if you voted for Trump, you were greedy. And but here's kind of a thoughtful formulation of what's kind of come across from several people. There was, per this person, lowest unemployment for Blacks and Hispanics that were historically low. Therefore, why do you call anyone who voted for Trump for policy reasons as greedy? Along the same lines, all people, Black and white, who were at a lower end of the economic scale saw their real wages increasing versus many years of stagnation. Is voting for those policies greedy?
So we would have to argue about the underlying assumptions that drive the representation of that data. Some people would argue that the slight increase in wages among workers was in some ways a result of the recovery that began under Barack Obama's administration. This is in some ways an extension of policies implemented in response to the Great Recession of 2008. So we have to see in some ways whether or not that data, and this is something what we would have to ask if people are willing to understand, right, or willing to conceive that the initial bump in the economy that we saw in the first years or the first days of the Trump administration were in fact a result of his policy decisions, or were they continuations of what some would call the Obama recovery? And I'm really critical of the Obama recovery because it didn't address the deep inequalities that were extant prior to 2008, right? Wall Street gets bailed out, Main Street's still suffering. So I want to be very, very clear here. So let me be clear too, I'm an independent in my political orientation, right? I'm as critical of the Democratic Party as I am of the Republican Party. So that's the first part of a response. The second part of the response is when we think about what Trump's tax cuts represented, right? First, they blow a hole in the in the federal budget. Who benefited disproportionately by those tax cuts, right? The claim around their benefits for the overall economy and for working people turned out to be not true, right? And the arguments that we constantly face when we think about when people are putting forward claims around universal health care, a living wage, raising the minimum wage, fundamental investment in education and the like, the question that we're asked all the time is how will we pay for it? People were asking the question, how will we pay for these tax cuts? And folks were sold, as we would say in Jamaica, a 649, right? That they would pay for themselves. And we know that's not true. And so part of what I'm saying is that there is a political class. I forget his name. I'm repressing his name on purpose. He's over the tax organization, short guy with a beard. That every policy initiative on the part of Republicans must involve tax cuts in some ways, right? And we can talk about that as a kind of reflection of the shift that happens in the Reagan years. So the short answer, Jonathan, is I want to dispute the attribution of those improvements to Trump policies, right? That's what I want to do, right? Because what we were seeing before COVID was not just simply, I mean, we already know that the trade war was having a devastating impact on farmers. We were beginning to see the implications of decisions that he was making for working people across the country that would challenge the picture that the questioner asked or put forward.
Yeah, the questions are getting more complex as we go along.
I love it. I love it.
Or at least the prelude to the questions. But one of them goes to really what the last two, bringing them together. The questioner says, you know, he had heard an African American on the radio say that the $1,200 stimulus check that Trump gave him improved his material condition more than any recent president. And this questioner asked, has a concern that some of the return to the neoliberal policies, whatever is characterized there, could alienate people more and create a situation where we bounce back to not Trump, but something like that in those policies.
That's a very good question, you know, because we have to understand that Trumpism is not just simply the result of, it's not just simply white resentment, white hatred, and white grievance. Underneath it is a sense of profound dislocation, a sense in which everyday ordinary folk who are busting their behinds to make ends meet can't imagine a brighter future for their children, that their towns have become ghost towns, that they're awash in debt, that some of them are having to make choices between keeping a roof over their heads and putting food on the table, right? Factories have shut down as jobs have gone overseas and the like, right? Their quality of life has in so many ways deteriorated over the last 40 years. Now, the question is how they account for that deterioration, right? Is it because of big government, right? Engage in the redistribution of resources by taking things from hardworking people and giving it to lazy, undeserving people? Is it because of bad immigration policies that lead to unjust competition as brown people come into the country and depress wages, right? We know that doesn't work, that doesn't pan itself out in terms of actual competition, where people are in the labor market, who's competing with whom, right? So the way in which people account for their misery, for their suffering, I want to suggest that in the Venn diagram, there is a point of convergence. Economic policy, whether it's from the Democratic side or the Republican side, whether it's Silicon Valley or Wall Street, has devastated workers, black, brown, green, purple, yellow. There's a reason why wages have flatlined for as long as they did. There's a reason why folk who are busting their asses, right, can barely keep their noses above water, while you have people retreating into gated communities able to afford, right, the privatization of the resources that allow them to live in those gated communities, right? There's been a kind of evacuation of the public space as the rich get richer and the rest of us are left to ourselves, right? So I think if we return to those policies, there's a possibility for deepening alienation. And in the United States, that alienation often takes the form of a populist movement from the right. And when it comes from the right, it comes with all of this ugliness vis-a-vis the other who has to bear the burden of it. I used this example on the radio today of Tom Watson. As Tom Watson, who was one of the most notorious racists in Georgia history, in the country's history. But before he became that, he was organizing with Black farmers in Georgia. He actually risked his life with other white farmers to protect a Black farmer from the usurpation of a Georgia landowner. But then he realized that if he was going to actually benefit white farmers, he would have to, marginalize these Black farmers, right? So the basis of solidarity became, right, this virulent whiteness. And so I think it's important for us to. So the short answer is, John, I keep saying this. It's a preacherly conceit. There has always been the possibility for marginalized Black, brown, and white people to join together. But that has always been a dream. It's, it's like, why wasn't the Free Soil Party, right, joined with the abolitionist movement? Why didn't they come together? Du Bois writes about this in Black Reconstruction, right? So I think there is definitely a chance for a deepening of alienation and a deepening of the ugliness at the heart of the American project if we return to economic policies that leave everyday ordinary working people languishing, right, barely keeping their heads above water.
Yeah, I think we have time for about 2 or 3 more questions at the most, so we're not going to get to them all, and some of them are very challenging. And so if
ask the challenging ones, I love those.
Well, all right, here we go. So we've had a lot of conversation in this country over the past year about racial injustice, particularly in the criminal justice system. I think everybody saw George Floyd and the horror of that, just so graphic, okay? But it is also a fact that a lot of police officers are murdered in this country every year in the line of duty. And how do we then, where we've got this, when you stop to think about how people polarize away from each other, if you've got a whole lot of people saying we have to face this, where there's another very, very large group of folks, first responders, who say, wait a second, that's not the whole story. That's not what we see. That's not what we're faced with every day. How do you address, there's a perfect polarized issue for you. How do you address that in the current climate?
Right, I think it's important for us not to see these issues as canceling each other out, right? It is certainly the case that police officers who are the only people who walk among us who have the legal right to use deadly force, right? They're the state. They have the ability to use deadly force. They are as Althusser would call them, the repressive state apparatus. They have an added responsibility in their ability to use deadly force. So I think it's important for us not to conflate holding police accountable and responsible for the ways in which they use deadly force and addressing the circumstances in which we're asking police to do their jobs. So police are often put in danger in communities that are resource deprived. They're actually asked to be social workers, mental health workers. They're asked to do things that they shouldn't be asked to do because they're not trained, because we've in some ways defunded the services that ought to be in place to address those crises, right? So part of what we have to do is to not say, right, that, oh, X murdered, but what about Black on Black crime? As if the invocation of Black on Black crime serves as a justification for the police's excessive use of force, right? Or to invoke a canard, Black on Black crime, as if that somehow explains something when we know that that phrase emerges within a particular political context. We don't have the phrase white on white crime. Why do we not have that phrase when in fact it happens? Because most crime in the United States happens within communities. And since the United States is hyper segregated, right, communities will prey on the people in those communities will prey on each other. So one way to respond to black on black crime is just simply to integrate our neighborhoods. Right? I mean, to be facetious in that sense, right? So we have white on white crime, we have a black on black crime. So what is that phrase doing? Because we know that black communities are over policed, over surveilled, and underprotected. I keep telling folks in Princeton, if the police came to Princeton, policed Princeton on a Thursday night and a Friday night and a Saturday night, like they police Trenton, New Jersey, the jails would look very different. Given what is happening in Princeton on Thursday. Y'all know this in Arizona. You know what I'm talking about, right? So part of what I'm trying to get at is that we have to kind of address what may very well be a false conflation rather, and what might very well be bad faith at the heart of the dispute, right? Because I think there are ways in which we can respect what police do, right? And hold police accountable for what they do wrong, right? I think those things can happen at the same time.
I'm going to close with this question, and there's
Sure.
a series of questions that are around it. Okay, we all have different perceptions of where we are as a country. But I think there probably is a pretty good consensus around the idea that if we're going to make progress, we need to come to better consensus, whether that's through structural methods, whether that's through discussion. One of the questions says that, can we even find that unity and consensus? Given our divisions. What is your suggestion to us as a College of Law, as a young college student, as a community member, as to the things we ought to do to try to bring a community together, knowing that there's always going to be disagreements?
Right. Let me just say up front that I don't want to presume that I have all the answers. I'm struggling like everyone in this country to figure out what our next steps ought to be, what they must be. I do know one thing, and I'll bank everything on it, is that we have to tell ourselves the truth about how we got here. What are the problems that we face? And together we can offer ourselves a thick description of the current malaise that threatens the Republic, I think. What can we do together? At the College of Law, it seems to me that we need to begin to have a conversation about what a just America would look like. Right? And I'm not just talking about the criminal justice system. I'm not just talking about policing, but what would a just America look like? I mean, we could concede some basic, facts, right? We can see racial disparities throughout the criminal justice system. We see it in who's arrested. We see it in terms of sentencing. We see it in terms of recidivist rates. We can just go down the line. We see it. What does it mean for a law school to grapple with the question? It's a moral question. It's an ethical question of what would a more just America look like? And of course, that question has as a background set of considerations, right? How can I put this? How might we be together differently? And I don't know how we operationalize that, but we have to figure out how to be together differently. We're walking mysteries to each other in this country, precisely because our intimate lives are so segregated, right? That's all you need to do to know how segregated your life is just think back to the last wedding you went to. And think about who was there. You get a sense of your private life. Outside of work, I'm at the pinnacle of my career. Outside of work, my world is my golf partner's Black. My world is as segregated as you can imagine, right? We're walking mysteries to each other. How can we figure out how to be together? But I will say this by way of closing. We can only begin the work of figuring out how to be together differently, of building a more just America, if there's common agreement among us about the value of democracy. There are those in our midst who will not concede that claim. If you do not agree that the background conditions for our disagreement is an agreement about the value of democracy, we cannot concede to their presence in the polity. That threatens the very foundation of our democracy. And that we must understand. We cannot compromise with those who are not committed to democracy itself. If we do, we seal our fate.
Right. That's a powerful close. And Dr. Glaude, I want to thank you again for taking the time this evening. I know it's late back in New Jersey and probably cold. So thank you very much for being with us and kicking this off. I do want to tell those who are still with us that on February 23rd, Ezra Klein is going to join us. Ezra Klein is going to be from 12:15 to 1:30. So it'll be before, not dinner, but lunch. If you don't know Ezra Klein, he was an immediate past publisher and editor of Vox. He's now with the New York Times. And he wrote a book called Why We're Polarized, which is right to the point of what we're talking about. In March, we're going to have Lawrence Lessig from Harvard Law School, who speaks a lot about the structural problems in the democracy that we're trying to strengthen, as well as some of the challenges we face with technology. And finally, in April, we're going to have Janet Napolitano, who we all in Arizona know well. And we certainly I don't have to give her an introduction here tonight, other than to say that we want to have somebody who's been in the lion's den. You can get everything about the series, the exact dates and times, and register at law.arizona.edu/Pitt21. That's law.arizona.edu/Pitt21. And so again, I want to thank all of you for being here. Look forward to seeing you in February with Ezra Klein. And again, Dr. Glaude, it's been a real honor to have you kick off our series for us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Everybody stay safe. Take care.
All right. Thank you. All right.